Okay, welcome everyone. I see people entering our webinar room. So wonderful to see so many of you joining us here today. My name is Luciana Cardarelli, and I'm Program and Member Services Coordinator with the Catholic Principals Council of Ontario. And together with my colleagues at OPC and ADFO, I'm very happy to participate in the creation of this series of webinars supporting your leadership when it comes to students and families who are working through the joys and the challenges of ASD.
And my name is Nazine Frépanier-Bisson. I am the Director of Professional Learning at OPC. So really lovely to see so many of you joining us this afternoon. And I want to just mention, for those of you who perhaps work in a French immersion or otherwise FSL program, or who are perhaps members of ADFO who are on with us, the ADFO webinar is happening next week. And at that time, the recording will be made available also in French as well as the PowerPoint. So whether you want to access it in English or in French, you'll have those options available to you. They'll be made, all of those resources will be made available to all leaders in the province.
I can see some people starting to access the chat room already. Know that we'll be monitoring all of that in terms of supporting the dialogue that's happening both from our panelists and between you as well. You know that you have a Q&A function that you can access as well, and you'll find those icons either at the top or the bottom of your screen depending on the configuration of your particular device. Good to see so many familiar faces coming online. Many of our Spec Ed for Administrators AQ instructors. Welcome to everyone.
Can you, Janine, take us to the next slide? Perfect. So the specific topic of this particular webinar, which is the second in a series of 3 for this year of work that we will be continuing through to next year, is implementing inclusive leadership, exploring PPM140 and applied behavior analysis. So that's our focus for the next hour or so. And we're happy today to have Janine Small, who is a member of OPC, to help support in the presentation, along with Stéphane Bone. Stéphane is an expert in autism, and so happy to have him with us today. And this was put together by a committee of people. So we have Janine and Stéphane presenting today. We have some other people who present the French language webinar, José Landriot and Pierre Campeau, along with Frédéric, who's the ED of ADFO, and that they'll be doing that next week. And then for the third webinar, our presenter will be Judith, Luciana.
Judith Desjardins from London Catholic. And also please know that prior recordings, as well as this and the third, will be available on your association website, either now or in the coming days. Should you encounter any difficulty today, if your signal becomes unstable, sometimes the easiest thing is to exit out and come back in again.
Next slide, please, Janine. So as we begin, we would like to take a moment for each of us to reflect. So we've made this land acknowledgement very generic because we're coming to you from different parts of the province. But if you take a moment to reflect about specifically the lands on which you are right now, that would be appreciated as we read this acknowledgement. ADFO, CPCO, and OPC would like to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on the lands on which we gather today across Ontario. And we thank the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. These lands are gathering points where age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation, and renewal took place. The Principals Associations are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn on these lands in a community of sharing. And so we've made efforts to connect this webinar and the others to the Ontario Leadership Framework, which guides our work as school leaders. And so in regard to this particular webinar and the other two, really, as it relates to autism and special education, special needs students and their families, those ties to the framework come under the building relationships and developing people column, where you have in the placemat, you have the 5 different areas of focus. And obviously, anytime that we're talking about serving students and parents, we're also touching on the idea of problem-solving expertise, knowledge of effective school and classroom practices that directly affect student learning, and those are two of the PLRs. And I think with that, we're handing it over to you, Janine and Stefan.
So as we get started, you'll see a poll that's popped up on your screen, and that's an opportunity for us to get to know who's joining us in the learning today. If you would take a moment, please, to answer those 3 questions. And once the poll closed, the results will be shown so we can better understand how it is that we can learn with and from you. You're invited to complete the poll, please.
Let's give it another 30 seconds and we'll move on.
So if you can't see the questions that are below, you have to scroll down in the polling window to be able to see the one below.
All right. Wonderful.
And if it's not working, I'm sorry, I don't have a solution, but we'll try to troubleshoot for the next time. The polling window should have appeared on your screen on top of the PowerPoint presentation.
And again, if you are struggling with some of the functionalities, a worst case scenario, if you go out and come back in again, that often rectifies little niggles in Zoom. And Sarah, once you see that we're in a good position and you want to close that poll, and you need to submit all the questions before you can submit. Thank you very much.
Are we good?
Yep.
All right. So welcome everyone. As we go through, for this particular slide, this is, I'm sure you've seen it, it's a Wordle, and it's just looking at some of the terminologies that have come out. So the current trend in research is to use the terminology autistic people. Essentially, we just need to recognize and respect how parents present their child, as well as how the children, or students rather, present themselves. Within the education setting and considering inclusive language use, we tend to refer to students with autism. So this is just a reference, or we'll just to take a look at some of the terminologies that are coming out. So what is our learning for today? Well, the learning goal is to review PPM140. It is also to look at, guide you through the main idea of ABA and give you the confidence to lead your team to ensure that your students with autism is getting the right programming. You already as administrators have these skills and tools. We want to guide you ensuring greater collaboration with school staff, parents, and outside organization to best support for students with autism. So PPM, sure if you've heard of it, PPM140 was first introduced in May 2007 by the Ministry of Education. And the purpose for this memorandum is to provide direction to school boards to support their applied behavior analysis and as an effective instructional approach in the education of many students with autism. This PPM has been very helpful in supporting students with autism. It also provides leadership and professionals with regard to the best practices for students with autism, and it allows consistent communication between families, professionals, and school boards. In regards to the principles of programming for ABA, so the principles which underlines ABA programming should be provided, to students with autism where appropriate. And we know, if you look at this, as talking about the program must be individualized, positive reinforcement is to be utilized, and data must be collected. So adhering to these principles require the acquisition, the consolidation and maintenance and generalization of skills that teachers, educational assistants, and other school board professionals must demonstrate. So the evidence suggests several key competencies areas are necessary for school staff to meet these needs students with autism, as well as evidence-based model training practices are suggested in meeting some of these competency areas.
And Janine, if I could just jump in for 1 second. We've had a question if there's any rationale behind the change in the terminology. And the Zoom broadcast, I think, is requiring that you slow down just a little bit so that participants are better able to get all your great information. Also, you and Stefan may want to turn your videos on as well.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Sure. I will slow it down. So I'm going through the next slide. So yeah, this slide is talking about applied behavior analysis using methods based on scientific principles. So it entails establishment of behavioral objectives, selection and application of valid and reliable measures, regular recording, consistent application of selected procedures based upon principles of behavior, applied methods, and it can help students develop positive behaviors, learn new skills, as well as transfer a positive behavior to or response from one situation to the other. So what do we know about applied behavior analysis? Well, regardless of the genetics, we know that all kids can learn. ABA can be used with just about any kind of problem. Understanding applied behavior analysis really applies to a whole range of situations in students. So ABA-based interventions can be more personal than some other approaches. They can be tailored, made to fit individual students. By setting objective, measurable, and observable behavior goals, progress is measured in terms of targets, best practices, and progress are also tracked as well. Since everybody is modifying behavior at all times, as we do, behavior interventions can easily apply to all students. And this is why we say that all students can learn. And in fact, students with autism, this is a really good method to be able to apply. I'm sure you've seen the ABA in terms of ABC charts before, if you've heard of it. So in order to collect appropriate data, and effective data collection methods such as ABC charts are often used. And ABC we talk about in terms of the A being the antecedent, B the behavior, and C the consequences. So we use the chart to determine patterns of behaviors and identify factors that might be used to predict behaviors or concerns. So the antecedent is usually what happens before the behaviors occurs. And obviously the behavior is what the student does. The consequences happens immediately after as a result of the behavior. And oftentimes some folks would think that when we say the consequence is usually negative, but it's really what happens after the behavior, be it positive or negative. ABC tracking, the chart, helps us in thinking about what is happening and looking at the behavior in the context of the whole event and not just a specific action. It's important to understand that ABC analysis views behavior as a function of the consequence as well as the antecedents. Behavior assessment, we attempt to, 1, define the target behavior, 2, identify the functional relations between the target behavior and the antecedents and consequences. And 3rd, identify effective intervention for changing the target behavior. Stefan?
Stefan, you'll need to unmute, please.
Sorry, everyone. I put myself on mute. To continue with what Janine was saying, one of the main components when we use ABA is collecting data. It's really important because, especially for school principals, when you're working with your team and when you're asking and when you get, either a teacher or an EA, no matter who goes to you and says, well, this kid has a lot of bad behaviors, we can't handle him, or he's disturbing the classroom. There's really 2 forms of data that we need to focus on. The first aspect, what's called baseline data, is you should always ask your team to do direct observation and get data without any strategies put in place, without any intervention by an adult, because you really want to see what before implementing any strategies or choosing the best methodology to respond to the need of that child. You really need to get your baseline. So what are the behaviors? So you can look at frequency, duration. Frequency is the amount of time. Often when I go in a school setting, they'll say, well, the kid, for example, spits all the time. So if I want to see frequency, I will ask, the teacher or whoever, if I can go and do observation for a short period of time and then really do the frequency of spitting, for example. You could also look at duration. So if the kid has a meltdown, how long does it last? Because the duration also provides us opportunity. Like Janine was saying, if you're looking at the antecedent, if it's through transition or the teacher asks the kid to do something and then it goes into a meltdown, you want to see how long it lasts. So it's really important to look at that, the rate, how often does it do it? And the latency. So how often in between, for example, when the teacher says to a kid, do this, how long does it take before the child reacts? The baseline is really so important because as a team and for all the school principal, when you're sitting around the table before you start making recommendation or asking the team what they're going to do, is they need to provide you raw data about some of the behaviors that they saw. So based on that, what you should always ask is, what is the issue? What's the problem? They need to define the problem before and then really look at some of the behaviors that they did observe. Based on that, then everybody, the ABC for me, really connects with the hypothesis. Why do you think the child is doing that? So if you get the ABC within, then well, it's true transition, or because he didn't complete his assignment, then he was persevering on not being able to disengage himself, to re-engage himself into another task. So you really need to get that, because once you get the function of that behavior, you'll be able to prioritize. Your team should always be able to define the problem, have an hypothesis, and then prioritize which behaviors are they going to target. And then based on that, you'll be able to really focus specifically on the behavior that you're going to be prioritizing. So that's the baseline data needs to happen. And the best way to do it also is always have what we call inter-observer reliability, meaning that you need at least a minimum of 2 observers looking at the same thing within the same context, within the same subject if it has to. So they're able to then compare, because once we do observation, we do influence the behaviors of kids when we go in the classroom, for example. So if you have at least a minimum of 2, that will help. After that, once you've looked at this, then you're able to, what we call ongoing data, is once you start trying to measure your hypothesis and measure what strategies you're going to use, ongoing data offers you the opportunity to see and measure if it's working or not. So that's really important. Observation is the key when we talk about ABA, because observation will lead to some of the technique people will use, a reinforcement system. What type of reinforcement system are they going to look at? Are we using differential reinforcement or contingent reinforcement? That's really important because it has an impact on the child's progress, but also on the child's independence. Because the more you do contingent, that means your ratio is going to be high. That means they need an adult to always reinforce certain behavior. Once you get into differential reinforcement, that means that you're measuring and you're teaching that kid alternative behavior or other behavior that they usually use that's maladaptive in that situation. So the ongoing data is really the key for us to use this data and have really a curve to see, are we on the right track? Is it working? How long did it take? And then what can we do based on the results?
And Stefan, we have a bit of a question here. If staff does not have formal ABA training, does that make it impossible for them to do that observational collection of data?
No, no, it's really important that we put things into context. Observation is a key factor that all professionals within different disciplines do. You know, and I think teachers, they do observation of their kids when they're doing independent work, when they're working as a team and all of that. I think what's specific when we apply ABA within is to, you need, when you do observation, direct observation, for example, you want to get information that you don't already know about the child. What I see that's a major issue in the school system is you get the Pygmalion effect. You get people that, oh yeah, he's autistic. So when they do observation, they're just trying to re-justify that that child is autistic. You're not, you know, seeking the behaviors that we already have the answer for. You're looking to understand why, how can we deal with it, and you know, how long will it take, and who's going to take charge. But any EA, any teacher can learn to do observation. You know, that's one thing. I think what, if I could add with that excellent question, is we need to be coaching all, like I coach school principals, I've coached superintendents to do observation when you get into a classroom, because that's important. When you get into the classroom, what are you looking for? When you go and look at the teacher, look at children, you're doing direct observation. You want to see if the strategies work. You want to see if what's the dynamic within the classroom, how the teacher is implementing or practice. And so everybody can do observation. With ABA, it's really specific. You're looking to function. You're looking to what's happening before, but you can learn to do it without having the title.
Okay. And just to add in terms of what Stefan is saying, so what are some questions that administrators, are you really at the helm, right? You've got to guide your team. And so there are some guiding questions that have come up. So what is the behavior? We talk about the behavior as an act or action that the student is exhibiting. It can be seen, it's tangible, it's not a feeling or emotion, it is not a disposition. It really is observable. And we've heard that, you know, in terms of when you're observing his behavior. Then we look at what is the function. And so what is the function of the behavior? A target behavior should be actions of students which are viewed as interfering or disruptive or problematic. But we also recall that there are 4 common functions of behavior. You've got escape and avoidance of demands or activities. You've got access to tangible items or preferred activities. And of course, attention. Most generally, folks have implied that behavior is happening because a child is requiring attention or needs attention. And the last one is sensory. So seeking or avoiding sensory input. So, and is the behavior, one of the questions to also consider is the behavior atypical for this particular student or group of students or peer group? For example, would this behavior be noticed, draw attention from others, or be considered unusual, disruptive in the community or in the environment or in the educational setting? So it is very much understanding what the behavior is and why the behavior is occurring. And that's why something like an ABC chart or a way of documenting that you are recording the behaviors. And of course, the key part is analyzing that behavior to find out how best to support it. So in going forward then, there are different, applied ABA is instructional methods that can be used, and not one suits for all students, right? So it is trial and method because you want to see what works with particular students. So we've got the classroom set up, how the classroom is set up as an example. You've got reinforcement, you have task analysis, prompting versus prompt fading, you have modeling, you have priming. These are all examples of ABA instructional strategies. There are others as well too. So when you look at we're going to talk about in the next few slides, prompting as well as reinforcing. So for example, reinforcement is that process whereby the delivery of something is following a behavior. So in other words, a consequence. So it maintains or increases the likelihood that the behavior will occur in the future. So when we reinforce a behavior, it increases whether it is a positive or negative, okay? So when we look at this, for example, for reinforcement, reasons to reinforce, you're going to reinforce a desirable behavior that supports learning. You're going to either teach new skills, you want to motivate and engage students, or you want to reinforce alternative behavior. Reinforcement really is immediate, contingent, it's frequent, it's varied, and it's paired with a praise. So I'm asking you, or ask you just to take a moment to reflect on how do you support school staff to incorporate ABA instructional strategies? How do you know that ABA has been implemented into your school environment? So the examples before reinforcement, you know, the classroom setting, the primary, do you know that if that is being integrated into your school? So if you know, that's something for you to reflect on.
Oh, and we've got a couple of questions or comments here, and I'm not sure if Stefan or Janine, you'll want to address them. One of them is about many of the behaviors being atypical compared to the peer group. And this was in reference to one of the questions on an earlier slide, but wondering about how helpful one of those questions, I'm assuming the last one, was it when the behaviors are atypical compared to the peer group. So that's the one of them. And then the other one was to briefly review what priming is.
Okay, if I can answer the first part about atypical. It's really important for school principals to ask, when we talk about atypical behavior, for example, is usually it refers to developmental milestone. So for an age and maturation, is the behavior manifested atypical for that group age? Then if you look for within autism, for example, what will look atypical compared to the neurodiversity, it's typical for the child with autism to manifest that behavior. So I think what's really important for everyone to understand is some behaviors are atypical because of chronological age versus developmental age, and also atypical because that child is autistic, or that child has Down syndrome, or that child has learning disabilities. It's typical to see these behaviors within that population, but if you always compare to the norm, then they're always seen as atypical. So you need to ask yourself, the behavior that we're seeing, is it affecting their learning? Is it having a negative impact socially? And what is the consequences emotionally?
And then the second part of the question, I believe, asked of one of the ABA strategies, such as priming. And priming is like you're previewing the activity or the lesson or with that student prior in advance, so you kind of reduce the anxiety that students may have. Okay. So in the next example is prompts. And when we talk about prompting, we need to be mindful. So prompts are cues or assistance that encourage the student to provide the desired response. And then of course we have prompt fading, which is gradually reduce the prompt until you get a natural response. Prompt can be classified from most intrusive to the least. And we know that sometimes we have full physical prompting, such as hand over hand, and sometimes we have to the point where we have verbal. The concerns or things that come up with prompting and prompt fading is that we need to be mindful of prompt dependency and how to avoid it. Prompt dependency occurs when we have too many prompts in place or not being faded quickly enough. And I will let you know that and I know in terms of working with an autism team, verbal prompts are one of the most difficult prompts to fade, as students are very much relied upon someone to prompt them. So that's another cue in terms of how you want. And I look at the prompting full of physical assistance to verbal, the least is, you're trying to build students' independence as they go through. in many school districts, we've applied, there are capacity to conduct applied behavior analysis, and sometimes there are behavior analysis folks, as well as people who perhaps may specialized in ABA. Behavior is really around the science of behavior when we talk about behavior analysis. Behavior analysis deal entirely most with learned behaviors, and we work to ensure improvements in behavior will be generalized to all of the important settings in that particular student life. So generalize the behavior from one class to the next, or from home to school. That's when we know behavior has been learned, because it's been generalized in the various different environments. So the analysis part of the behavior refers to our search for maintaining variables that prompt a behavior, and those that we keep going. You also want to make sure that observe closely and determine how and when the behaviors are reinforced and by whom. And then you also want to break down complex behaviors into functional parts. So we talked about in terms of previewing, but also chunking as well. A successful analysis should be able to produce complex behavior by combining its parts with the behavior synthesis. So you are looking at, clearly what is the function of the behavior, and trying to figure out how best to support students in that particular way.
And Janine, as you pause there, we've had a question for a little more information around differential and contingent data. So if you or Stefan could take that, please.
That's an excellent question. Contingent is when the child gives you behavior A, you reinforce immediately. So usually contingent reinforcement is used to create a trust, a relationship with the child, but also to reinforce at a high ratio in order to motivate the child to be able to complete the task, or transition, whatever you're looking for. So when you're using contingent, eventually you'll go to intermittent. So then the same behavior, you might decide that, once the child did show that behavior 5 times, then you'll reinforce. When you're talking about differential reinforcement is, if you look at the reinforcement, the differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, so that means when you're teaching these kids with social skills, whatever other skills, other behavior that you want, as soon as they use an alternative, more adaptive behavior, you'll reinforce. If he uses the same behavior that's maladaptive, then you might redirect the child, you might reprompt the child. So differential is of other behavior, alternative, incompatible, meaning that if you're teaching a young kid to sit at his desk, then each time that he's sitting, you'll reinforce. If he gets up, then you'll redirect. And so that means incompatible. You can't be standing up and also sitting at the same time. There's also low frequency, and so that gets more complex, but it's when you see that the child has a good behavior that you're looking for in his repertoire, but he's not using it often, then you might reinforce. And the other one is, for example, if you're looking to diminish spitting, like I said, I would go and really do observation for a period of 20 minutes. I'll count how many times he spit. And after that, I'll use differential reinforcement. So if he spits under 20 times, then he gets the reinforcer.
Okay. Stefan, continue with this one as well.
Yes. What we've seen in the education system that's really, that I'm very proud, especially in Ontario, is we've really moved on, we've progressed when it comes to taking care of the kids, not just autism, but kids in general. At first, for many years, there was a lot of the expert model. So people were called in. Sometimes I still see that today, but I try to always work with the team to be more holistic. But if you get into the expert model, for example, for any services or for any placement, still a lot of school boards are using a psychological assessment. So what it causes a lot of latency and also all the stress is on one evaluation. And so the expert model is really used to be useful for placement, but now we're seeing more and more, especially with autism. It's such a diverse and complex disorder. And now that we see it as a neurodevelopmental disorder, even if you get a psychological assessment, it's not going to give you the strengths and the needs all the time with regards to that. So there was a movement from the expert model to what we used to call multidisciplinary team. So you would get into the school system, like you could get an EA, you could get a resource teacher, you could get a vice principal, you could get a teacher, an SLP, an OT. Everybody would come in, but everybody would have a voice based on their knowledge, based on their theoretical beliefs. And so that was not based on problem solving, but more of a discussion of who's right and who's wrong. And that really upsets a lot of the teachers when you're in that approach. And I know it because often when I do work with some of the school, and if I do observation, I'll go in and I'll say, well, you know what, based on the observation, this is what I would recommend. And all of a sudden you get a teacher telling me, yeah, but the other person that just came the other day is saying the opposite. So the multidisciplinary often will lead to more arguments based on the discipline and the theory background of that professional. What we're at now, and I find that's really important, is within the interdisciplinary approach, the child is part of the team and also the parent. So rather than you know, defend your theory or your discipline, you will mostly talk about methods and different approach to you know, help that child reach specific goals. So it is focused on problem solving. It also allows the school principal to say, okay, who's going to do the observation? So everybody's got a specific role, and then we all regroup with a common vision, which includes the parents, because often the parents, they'll give us observation from home, and then you'll get people giving us indirect observation because of incident report, because of report cards, because of the of a assessment that they went through and found certain key elements to bring to the table. So the interdisciplinary is very important. In the best of world, and I hope that eventually we get there, within the transdisciplinary is when you create a unit. So that means it's not just the people on, you know, the frontline workers that are debating and working with the parents, but also the decision makers. So the school principal is part of that unit. Often what I've seen, because some school boards I've been working with for 7 years, often when we've created that, you know, unit, it's either the vice principal that will, you know, be responsible, and within that we go and get the people that are able to bring the knowledge, the practice within that unit. So that means that the director of education is part of it, superintendents are part of it, director of services are part of it, but school principals, they're the voice that makes the communication between upper up, top down, and bottom up. So it's not there now. Some school boards are looking into that, but that would be the best way to do it, because we would avoid always making decision based on oh, he's autistic, or his parents, they don't know what to do, whatever. It would be more sound and well taught.
Okay.
When we talk about collaborative service, you know, I've worked with the autism program for many years. This collaborative service, what was really important when it came out, was with regards to 2 different ministries working together to make sure that the transition was smooth, that both sides, so community workers and the school personnel could really work together to improve the outcome. So we've seen, when I say that we saw some progress, at first, I remember when the IBI came in Ontario, people were either bringing their kid into the clinical setting or they were doing services from home. But then we saw through the years that school boards did share some classroom where the IBI was done within the school. And they found out that it was better because they could generalize skills. The child was also learning within the school environment. Where it really still was an issue was with sharing about what was being done within the IBI and how sometimes there was a gap in between. So where it really worked is when the school principal, as the leader of that school, made sure that there was often meetings where they could share. It also improved the support for the kid and also provided an entrance for the parents to gain trust in the school environment. So collaboration has been around. There is still a lot of work to be done, but I think we're on the right path.
And in light of thinking about collaboration and look at this proverb as well as this quote, they say it takes a village to raise a child. I think it takes a child with autism other special needs, special education needs rather, to raise the consciousness of a village. And so with that in mind, and as we've introduced it, as we look forward, we're now thinking about collaborative ways that we can support students with autism. And so in looking at the phases, we know that as school boards, you must offer students with special education needs programs and services to support autism, including where appropriate, ABA instructional approaches. So if you take a moment to think about where you are at the board in terms of who are your board contacts or community partners who could provide support for students with autism as well as ABA, links to this again is going to be a good sort of startup or to think about in the future in terms of webinar number 3, where we explore more in detail some of Rose's collaboration. But it's good for us to start thinking about who should be or could be at the table when programming for students with autism. And phase 1 of our collaborative support model, we're talking about making sure to collaborate with community agency. When we collaborate with our agencies, we know we build effective practices as well as we'll build capacity within coordinated efforts so that it's seamless and students are transitioning from one sort of context to the next. When we think about our phase 2 of collaborative service delivery for students with autism, we're looking at the collaboration between school boards and ABA as well as autism programs that may be out there. So we must look for a transition because we know that students with autism transitions is certainly high up there in terms of needs, and that they're needed transitions. Make sure we have transition plans set out that are in place as well. So anything that we do, especially with our collaboration, it does work for seamless transition. Students coming from IBI, ABA, as well, and this has been in place. I believe that partnership that Stefan mentioned has been in place since 2009. In looking at when we talk about, again, continuing with collaborative services, it needs to be student specific, right? We move in from, as Stefan showed, the chart from our multidisciplinary approach to an I think most folks are interdisciplinary. We'll get into that transdisciplinary phase. We want to definitely communicate with parents to gather and share information. They know their child's best as it relates to our educational plan. We want school-based transition teams. We know principals, vice principals, support staff, teachers. We want all those involved. It could be outside agencies that are supporting students as well. We want to make sure that everybody is collaborative on that front. We want to look at entry into school for our students, transition between activities, the settings, a classroom, transition between grades, moving from. And then of course in this, we're remiss if we did not mention in terms of our remote support, remote way of doing things right now, we also have to start thinking about how do we transition students, particularly those with autism as well. Secondary to post-secondary, there's a lot of folks that we need to collaborate with in order to make sure that the transition for student is smooth, but certainly a collaborative front. Stefan?
Thanks. What's really important, to go back to this interdisciplinary, especially, I'm so happy that we're talking to school principal and vice principal, because the purpose, the goals that we're looking for is to create awareness of where the situation about that child, where the students is within is learning. It's also for the school principal to be able to ask if within their school they have the right people to help that student. I think, we need to start having more trust within the people that are within that school. Because if we always call from outside at the boards for everybody to come in, we're not building capacity. We're just, asking somebody else to come in and do the work, and then they leave. So the consultation model doesn't really work with the interdisciplinary team approach, because everybody's around the table and talking, and they're defining a common vision of the problem. So then you're able to really go within the steps, then what is the overview of the situation? And then you're able to define that problem. That should always be documented. I always say, all my colleagues that are school principal, we always document that aspect, how people are defining the problem, how they see that child that they're dealing with, because that really says a lot, especially when you get somebody that's tired or stressed or is not sure what to do anymore. Sometimes the problem is really out of proportion. So, the school principal is also a person that can be there to really help that person. And then when we get into the procedure aspect of it, the principal should always be aware of what's happening. I know everyone is very busy, but to inform somebody, it's not taking an hour every day. It's just to either through email or to a log or even into a journal, whatever, is to make sure that the principal is aware of what strategies, is it working, what's happening, where's the student, is he always out in the hall, or is he always in a different classroom because he's unable to be in? Because if the principal knows that, then that gives them the opportunity to call a meeting and say, whoa, listen, we're putting reinforcement, we're putting all these strategies, and it's not working. There's no inclusion, there's no independence, so there's a major issue. So that's really important. I see people telling me all the time, yeah, we're using ABA, but how come that child after 5 years still has an EA full time? And how come he spends 80% of his time outside the classroom? That's not success. That's really just, reinforcing this dependency of one-on-one. So I think school principal, they have such a great role to play within. And then always arrange meeting with school staff, parents. Like I say, I always, each time I go, no matter where I am, if I am in France, I do the same thing, is every 4 to 6 weeks, I do a follow-up with everyone. How is it going? What are the objectives? And then I'll answer the question if parents have some. I'll help my colleagues, will be supportive. But you should always, between 4 to 6 weeks, really discuss of what's happening. Is it working or not? So that's really important. So when we're talking about within that approach, what's really also interesting is who is going to create the student profile. So the only way to create that student profile will be through direct observation. Indirect observation, meaning that some people will be in charge of doing direct observation to see what's happening. Other people should be asked, either the resource teacher to look at the IEP, to look at report cards. If the school principal needs to look at the incident report, what's happening, and then somebody else could also analyze any psychological assessment to what is the key factor that represents that child. So that should always be clear that you need a profile and not just the IPRC of what are strengths, what are interests, and what are needs. That's not a profile. That's just really expressing limited data about a specific kid. So you really need to create a portfolio about that student, having proof, meaning that you should always bring to the table any work they've done, any report card, what's working, what's not. And then again, I'll come back to the inter-observer reliability. You need more than one observer. And then they need to share and agree that what they did observe, that it makes sense, and eliminate any behaviors that was caused by us being there. And so it's important for a school principal to assess the reliability of the observation. Don't hesitate to question, please. Thank you.
This one is as well.
Yep. And then that's where we start really working as a team. So when we start choosing the objective, so define concrete and specific objective. So I always try to have two objectives that I'm working over a period of 4 to 6 weeks. One is always social, emotional / self-regulation / behavior. And one is always pedagogy, the learning aspect. We should always be working with both aspect of a child within a school environment. I can't just work on behaviors if the behaviors are caused because the way that the subject or the task is presented is what causes the child to have meltdown. If I don't change the practice, then we're not going to see a big difference in the behavior. Is it feasible? Is it attainable by the student, by the school staff? Are they prepared? Because once you open that can of worm with regards to behavior, there might be a storm before the sunshine. So you need to start something, because if you quit in the middle, next time the extinction burst is going to be really hard. And then you have the available resources within that school setting to do it.
Stefan and Janine, we've got a couple of points that I think I'd like to bring to the attention of the whole group, and if you'd like to comment, of course. So we have someone who's indicated how important it is that as leaders, we are aware of power dynamics, especially in our role as principal and vice principal, and how unconsciously we can either enable or diminish participation in the presence of others, where people are sitting, where the meeting is held, what acronyms and specialized language that we use that may make people feel excluded. And you know, the essence here is that unwittingly we might be excluding the voices of those that we most especially need to hear from. And the other point is that who is doing the observations after transitions? 2 or more observations independently, but who might be included in managing and carrying out those observations?
Okay, I can answer, give you an answer, and then Janine, don't add, please. For the first, with regards to having a real team approach, a real interdisciplinary team approach, is I always say that anyone that's involved in the services towards a child should be part of the team. They should all have a voice. If it's an EA, that EA will probably bring to the group some specific observation that he or she has. I think also what's important is within that approach is if the child is able to be there, he's there, but the parents are part of. And what I've seen, just little changes, what I've done with some of my colleagues within certain schools, within the interdisciplinary approach is when there's a meeting, we all gather in the entrance and meet the parents, and we all go in the room together with no already preconceived who sits where and all of that, because after time the parents are on one side of the table and you get everybody else around. So that creates anxiety, and it's not good for any exchange. With regards to observation, I think when we say that at least 2, I think in any transition, if it's from the IBI to the school, there should be a teamwork. So there should be one person from the IBI and one person from the school. Once that transition is done, you could easily, I've coached a resource teacher to do observation, because again, if you always choose objectives, one that's really behavior and the other one that's more pedagogy, then you could easily train and support resource teacher, and there's multiple positions to do observation with regards to the learning process of that child, and then sit together and say, oh, okay, now I understand why the kid is not motivated, because he's escaping right away because he doesn't understand the task. And then so at least you have a combination of pedagogy and behavior, and it makes sense. So then you're able to create real objectives.
And if I could please add that in the initial question part is, we need as administrators to really think about our intent versus the impact. So we may have at a particular meeting, group of parents that are there, and you may be, in the best interest what you think, but the impact of what is happening will certainly be impacted on the families, on the parents, as well as the student. So I think in terms of being very mindful of the acronyms that we use, not everybody is in our educational world and understands some of our acronyms. So being intent, explicit when we talk with parents, and again, inviting for their input as well. And I think more will certainly become when we talk about webinar 3, that is, when we talk more specifically around some of those collaborative parent partnerships as well. So in terms of the interdisciplinary team approach, what is common from what Stefan is saying is we want to make sure that there is a common vision, acceptable for the students, the parents, as well as school staff. We want to make sure we develop intervention strategies and choose the means for implementing them. And that is not solely on one person. You want to invite your parents. And we know that parents are strong advocates for their child. You want to invite students, and where appropriate, there are some students, particularly in our secondary, who are able to understand, sit at meetings as it relates to them. Your teachers, support staff, sometimes they're involved with community agencies. You might want to get them involved as well, because sometimes they know the students in a different way. You want to plan the meetings. You want to have your communication, as Stefan mentioned before, your documentation of that meeting, of follow-up, and who is to follow up. Is there something that the parent is expected to follow up on, something the teacher is expected, or the support staff, administrators? And of course, more would be said around conflict resolution strategies. We have shared solutions. That's a document that's available for us to certainly look at. But every time, sometimes when we have meeting, conflicts are not always a bad thing. Folks need to be heard. People need to be heard. Students need to be heard. Parents need to be heard. You want to make sure the voices of all that are at the table are being heard. In terms of best practices, why do we use the interdisciplinary team approach? Stefan has mentioned quite a lot of information around that. We want to use it because there's a lack of inter-radar reliability, and I can ask Stefan just to explain that a little bit more among parents, school staff as well. Because each observer, as you're saying, bring different lens to the conversation or to the observation. It's important that we get to see and hear from different people's perspectives. We want to make sure that the behaviors that can occur in certain environments, but not in others, which also explain the differences between groups of students. So sometimes parents may say they don't behave like that at home, or they behave at school. So we want to make sure that skills that we are teaching are transferable. And it is quite possible that behaviors will only be observable in certain contexts, because perhaps a trigger is in that particular context and not another. Anything you want to add to that, Stefan? You good?
No, I think you did a great job.
Okay. All right. I think we've seen this image from the webinar for those of you who participated, but these are just things to remember. So referring back to the first webinar, we can now begin to see the significance of the interdisciplinary approach to meet the needs of students, that a collaborative approach can have the most impact on students' learning and their behavior. The stage in which functional impairment rather becomes evident will vary according to the characteristics of each child with autism, and it also depends on their environment. We also want to bring awareness to the pervasiveness of living with students with autism and parents as well. It affects every aspect of life. And there are things that, for example, when we see the iceberg, there are things that are observable, and there are some things that are not observable. And the things that are not observable is perhaps the one that's an impact on the things that we see. So we do need to question and ask, why is that behavior happening? It's not because students want to be bad, but we really need to make sure we understand the behavior, because we know that behavior is a form of communication. So, and communication does fall under that exceptionality. So we want to make sure that we understand why students are behaving that way, because there's a reason for it, and we want to be able to help them in that communication. So I guess in conclusion, we looked at PPM140. We hope that this webinar has helped you to deepen your understanding of, or rather review of PPM140 and the importance of ABA as students transition. We know that it's a change in practice for some, but at the same time, it's something that we have been working on throughout or over the years. Hope that you can see where you're at now, where perhaps you'd like to go next with your staff, and things that perhaps you want to think about in your next step for planning, programming for students. And although these strategies have been presented in this particular context of working with students, we know that it could be beneficial for all students with special education needs. There are universal strategies that is used for many students, but certainly highly effective with our students with special education needs and autism. So ABA instructional strategies that work for all students have been proven to change behavior for not only students with autism, but others as well. I've actually heard the other folks have used ABA instructional strategy to teach other students, or in terms of behaviors that we would like to see happen. It can be used for that purpose and not just for students with autism. Using the interdisciplinary team approach defines the role and responsibility of all, and we avoid miscommunication. We want to make sure everybody's on the same page, and that we are communicating, certainly in hearing the voices of parents and everyone with different perspectives, but through our interdisciplinary team. We want to also ensure that we're all working towards the same goal, and that the student remains the center of all our discussion and decision making that we do it always. So as the principals, you set the tone. You are in the driving seat. You are there. You're the coach. You listen. You advocate for staff and students, and it is essential in creating a collaborative environment. Staff, students, and families need to be heard. And as you lead, you can ensure that the needs are being met and that staff have access to training and supports that they need. That the support that they need in order to provide the best programming for students. Parents are they are valuable assets, and we need to include them in our discussions and bring essential information from them, use them, as well as to build trust. And we know that certainly when families see the school and as supporting and trusting, then things work a lot better for our students.
So we do have some information there on the next webinar. Gabriella, Sarah, if you could put up the poll, the final poll, thank you. So just another poll quickly to help us gauge in the moment how this session has been of use to you and your intentions to be on the third webinar. We will also be sending a feedback form link. Sarah will likely post it in the chat, and then we will send it by email also. That feedback is important. So some of you have been on the first one. We're here again with us today, and some of you will be with us on the next session on June 10th, I would expect. At the same time, we understand that not everybody's available, which is why we record these and make them available. But this project is a multi-year project. So we are in year one of a 3-year project. And so the feedback that you provide through the feedback form, where we are able to ask more open-ended questions, will help inform the work of the committee on the next next pieces of this work in year 2 and in year 3. So there's a question around the recordings. So the recordings will be available on each of your association's websites along with the PowerPoint. So we will be able to email the PowerPoint out probably tomorrow, but the video will take a little bit of editing, so that will be available sometime in the next week or so, I would say. And for OPC members, we will put a note in the bulletin letting you know that those are available, but please have a look for them on your association websites. IDFO will post on theirs as well after they've had their French language webinar next week. And I want to just say thank you to everyone on the committee, particularly today to Stéphane and Janine for their facilitation of the session, and to Sarah Morrison, who is a project coordinator at OPC, who is behind the scenes hiding where she likes to be, but ever so present to help us with any technical issues and keeping us on track and supporting the committee with all of the work to get these together. So thank you to everyone. And Luciana, final word over to you.
Thanks so much, Nadine. So as we were getting the conclusions pulled together just now, I received an email, and to our CPCO associates, please know that the first webinar is now available for viewing on our website. You'll need to log in as an associate first to get behind the firewall to grab it, as well as the resources that were shared. And just to echo Nadine's sentiment in terms of thanks so much for your participation. I think at one point we were 280 people, and your input helps us present our proposal for future work with the ministry. So we so value what you have to say, and it's our role as servant leaders to ensure that we bring your voice forward. Thanks again. Thanks for taking time today. Stay well, stay safe as we all learn and build this plane together as we're flying it. See you on June 10th.
Thank you.
Thank you.